My guess is Bill Long shot people. There was guys running around the world that wanted Bill Long dead. He says, I've shot so many guns. I've shot so many times. He says, I can fill this cabin half full of ammo.
You are listening to Gunslinger's Shadow, an outlaw history podcast about the most prolific Wild West outlaw you've never heard of, Bill Long.
I remember my grandma over and over and over telling Bill Long stories. It was one of my favorite things to do, is to go down to her house with my dad, and we would just sit down around her chair and we'd just listen to Bill Long stories. In fact, I got 4 audio tapes from her still telling those stories. And one of them that I remember is a book. It's called The Outlaw Trail. It's everybody that is in outlaw world knows it's kind of a Bible of the stories of outlaws, particularly the Wild Bunch. Interestingly enough, this book was written by Charles Kelly. Just as a side note, Charles Kelly was his first superintendent of Capitol Reef. And in fact, in the 1952 National Geographic, there's a picture of my great uncle and Charles Kelly in a Jeep down in the desert, and an article written about that. So that's kind of, there's not a question in our mind that Charles Kelly was a family friend and connected to this story of Bill Long. So when he wrote this book, he never mentioned Bill Long in it because Bill Long was still alive. He had to cover him. So what happened there is my grandma's youngest brother, Perry Jackson, my grandma was raised around Bill Long, so she knew him better than Perry did. She knew him way better than anybody did, almost, except for his 2 daughters. Perry went to his sister and says, who is this picture? And she immediately just kind of automatically looked at it and said, oh, that's Uncle Bill. Kind of like, and then her response was, how did they get that picture of Bill, Uncle Bill, in that book?
It's awesome. I think from her perspective, it would have been fascinating because she grew up with him. You know, someone brings a book to her. It's a book about outlaws, and she sees a picture of him, and she says, "What? What is happening?"
Yeah. Now, the interesting part about that is that the picture is Bill McCarty. So why does Bill Long look like Bill McCarty? There's a lot more to that part. So, yeah, and for my grandma to identify him like that automatically, it says, how did Uncle Bill's picture get in there?
And that's a picture of Bill McCarty, though. Like the book says it is, at least.
Right.
You know? Which is a whole different issue. Anyway, but my grandma would know him like the back of her hand. It's just like you trying to identify me someday.
Yeah.
You know, you'll know exactly who I am.
Someone shows us a picture of your dad or your uncle or whatever, and you're like, of course that's why is this picture? Why is Dad's picture in there, right? Yeah. Do you think that your grandma knew that Bill Long was an outlaw, or do you think that it was a little further from her?
Living here in Fremont, in Wayne County, when she was young, and Bill Long was here also, she knew that when the police came into town looking for Bill Long, that they would run over to him and let him know, hey, they're after you. And then he would run up and hide up in Danish Meadows.
And he would keep, so I recall from the stories you've told me, he would keep a horse saddled in his barn at all times, right?
24/7, 365, his whole life that we knew him. And I'm assuming that he didn't tighten up the belt buckle. He probably left that kind of loose or hanging. Mm-hmm. But even when he was an old man, he was ready to go at a moment's notice.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, that's like keeping your car running almost, or at least keeping the keys in the ignition and out the garage, aimed the right direction. So, the cops show up and you can jump in and you're out of there.
Well, what's interesting about that story is that when I've talked to 2 or 3 of his grandkids, they didn't really understand why. Because
Mm.
they didn't have the whole story. They didn't know they weren't told much about his outlaw stuff, so they
Mhm.
didn't know that. But my guess is Bill Long shot people. Yeah, and so there was guys running around the world that wanted Bill Long dead.
If they didn't know he was a criminal or an outlaw, like how did
You know what, Adam? That's a really good point. Bill Long must have let them know that if you see something, to let him know and don't say anything about it. And we don't know that he went up to Danish Meadows, but we do know that he left town to his local hiding place.
there's other people that have kind of tried to figure out who Bill Long is, particularly his descendants, because they knew that there was something different about him.
Well, I was thinking about this the other day. William Henry Long, the character of this guy, he has been pursued by somebody since he was young, and he went to the cowboy camp. During his outlaw years, of course, he was pursued by people that
Mm.
wanted him. And then after he died, his daughter said, "Who is he?" And so she started her lifelong pursuit of trying to find out who her dad is. One of his granddaughters said there's lots of people that wanted to write a book on Bill Long, but they couldn't get the story straight. This is the first time that we were able to directly connect William Henry Long to the Wild Bunch. Because my question is he just like a secondary outlaw? Is he a primary outlaw? Is he a Wild Bunch member? Or maybe he was just his own outlaw and just went and stole stuff from people. And any rate, when we talked to her, her name was Sherma Payton. But when she was 18 years old, her dad was working as an engineer, and they were building at that time the dam up there at Flaming Gorge. But a
Mhm.
little bit more background with the Wild Bunch. Of course, Brown's Hole is just upriver from the dam, and Brown's Hole was a well known Wild Bunch hideout, mainly because there was three states within that very close proximity: Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. And so if they got into trouble, they could run across state lines real easy. But up in that little area called Brown's Hole was a family called the Bassets. Ann Bassett was well known as possibly Etta in history. We've been able to say otherwise, but a lot of people think that Etta Place was Ann Bassett and her sister Josie, and they knew him personally very well. They went to Vernal, and I think it was at the museum, and
Mm. Like a
and
curator.
yeah, and what they were looking to try to find out information, and they said, well, you know what, we can tell you a story about what happened to Josie Bassett. First thing she told them is that she didn't want this story to be told to anybody. So this is a hush hush story. Don't tell anybody about it. You never heard it from me. Josie would go on these 7 mile walks every day, and one day she didn't come back for several days, which is kind of odd. So, and the friend was worried about her, so she came to check her out. Why didn't she come back from her 7 mile walk? And so she says, "Well, I got to tell you, the Wild Bunch gave me a birthday party in Arizona,
What in the world?
in the Pines in Arizona."
Mm.
And so, though, when she goes ahead and she says it was Butch Cassidy, it was a Sundance Kid, and there were 8 other guys there, and they held a birthday party just for me. They each came independently. That's an interesting point. So one at a time, these showed up. They didn't all just show up at one time. So to keep their identity covered up in the world, they all
Mhm.
showed up one at a time, and they all left one at a time. And so Sherman got her father involved, which her father wanted to know who Bill Long was.
Mhm.
They knew that Josie Bassett lived in a house along the Green River, right by Split Mountain Gorge, north of Jensen, just east of Vernal. And so that was really close to where they were working. And so they decided just to go knock on this lady's door. Now, a little bit of background with Josie Bassett. They supposedly she got married to a guy, and he died mysteriously. Have no idea why. Just knew that he died. So What does she do? She gets married again. And a few years later, he comes up mysteriously dead. And there's
Mm.
2 graves in the backyard. And this goes on and on. 5 different husbands.
Once
And
is a
there's,
coincidence, twice is happenstance, 3 times is a pattern here.
At that point, I don't think I'd want to marry that lady at that point, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the logic that old Silas Laverle had was that maybe she would know Bill Long.
Mm-hmm.
That's good logic. And so he takes the picture of Bill Long that we all have, and he goes up there to visit her, knocks on the door, and he said he told her that he had a family member in his family that was an outlaw in the Wild Bunch, and he wanted to know if it was the same Wild Bunch. And she says, "Yeah, I'll be glad to talk to you." She invited him in. She was very friendly. And then when they took his picture out and showed that to her, she immediately changed her nature, her look. She was fully willing to talk about anything until she saw the picture of Bill Long. The minute she saw that picture, she immediately just shut up and said, "You need to leave, and I'm not willing to talk anymore." That's period. That's it. End of story. Done.
Oh, man.
I wonder what those grandkids were thinking, Silas and Sherma. They probably thought, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Well, she didn't say, "Well, I don't know who he is." She didn't
Yeah,
say that.
right.
She knew exactly who he was.
Right.
But see, and think about that story for a minute. So much of Bill Long we don't know about. Why? Because he made sure that whoever was in his circle of influence knew that you don't tell anything about me to anybody.
Yeah.
So she could talk about Butch Cassidy. She could talk about the Sundance Kid. She could talk about Harvey Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, or
Yeah.
any of these other guys, but not Bill Long.
Oh, man.
I think it goes to show a little bit of his character about how he influenced people, the way he lived his life, and why he was so successful at maintaining a hidden identity until, well, like we said last episode, it's 2023 and we're still digging it up, right?
Yeah.
We're still trying to figure out who this guy is because he had such an influence over the people that were close to him. And I mean, there are other stories, right, about why he's an outlaw, but I think this one is like, oh my gosh, this lady is close to the Wild Bunch, and she's unwilling to even talk about who he was years after he was dead.
Why wasn't William Henry Long in all of these bank robberies
Yeah,
listed in the newspaper?
right.
Why wasn't William Henry Long listed in any of the outlaw books?
Yeah, I have some expertise in this area in terms of newspapers and digging into newspapers. And if you read about these bank robberies, the newspapers got it wrong every single time. They don't know what the aliases are. They don't know who's there. They don't know who gets killed. They know the story that's being told is told from the perspective of those that got robbed. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's
Well,
like
yeah,
history is written
yep,
by
yep.
specific kinds of people, and so these people share this story, and they have all sorts of speculations about who it is. But that's a good reason why Bill Long, who was just tight on his identity and what he was involved with, is not always named, right? Or not named correctly.
Very few of them have a positive identification of whoever was in that particular bank robbery.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them do because they got put in jail and they think that it is this person, but these guys were masters of ID cover up. They
Yeah.
they were masters. One of the stories is that Bill had 40-44 pistols, and those 40-40, he was proud of them. There was a pair of them, and he even mounted them. He had a brass ring and somehow welded it to the handle or something. I'm not sure. And he had the gun mounted on that, and then the brass ring was mounted on a wood base. And so, sitting in his living room, you could, if you come into his house, you could see his guns. And interestingly enough, on that one, is that at some point later in his life, up in Duchesne where he was living, something changed in his head, and he decided he wasn't really as proud of them as he thought he was. He decided that he didn't like them anymore, and is mostly, I'm assuming, what they represented to him.
Yeah.
He probably killed men with it. He messed up people's lives with it. He robbed money from he shouldn't have done.
Mm-hmm.
And so he took those guns and he went out in the yard. And this is up in Duchesne, and he buried them in the ground to get rid of them. This is, of course, way before metal detectors. He didn't know that somebody could come find them. That's another project for somebody to do someday, and I hope to get involved with that. But,
Yeah, we definitely need to
Yeah, that's
Better get
right.
up there before anybody else does.
Yeah.
I think he's a man of like competing motivations, because he certainly is an outlaw. He's a lawless person. He's highly influential of the people that are around him. And he has these things like these 40-44s, which are sort of famous pistols that people that were outside the law at the time were known to use. But also, for instance, he knew how to shoot. All the stories that I've heard about Bill Long are that he was a crack shot, right?
Oh, he was a super crack shot. In fact, one day he was with two of his grandsons. Yeah, they weren't his blood grandsons. It was his wife's grandsons.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably Tom Jackson and probably Ray Jackson. And they were up at Forsyth Reservoir up here about 5 miles out of town. And their objective was to go down to the bottom of where the water comes underneath the dam. And we've done this many, many times since I've done it. They used to be able to access a valve, and so you could turn the valve off and turn the water coming out to UM Creek off. And when that happened, you could just dip the fish out with nets and throw them in a gunny sack and come home with lots of fish. The problem is this is illegal, and so he told his grandsons, he says, "Look," he says, "we're going to do this, and you guys go down there and start fishing. If Hanson, the game warden, if he starts showing up, if you hear one gunshot from me, run. If you hear two gunshots, just go fishing some more." And so the story goes, they were down there fishing, and guess who shows up with a horse? The game warden.
Oh man!
And the game warden hadn't seen Bill Long yet, because he was probably not on his horse at that point. He was probably sitting behind a rock. I don't know. And so Hanson gets off his horse on the edge of the hill, looking down to the river, and he's crawling up to the edge of the hill to see down the river. And before he gets to the edge, Bill Long pulls out his pistol and he shoots him between his fingers. Okay, so he's going like this, and he gets a gunshot right between his fingers. And immediately the guy gets a petrified look, and he looks straight towards where the gun come from, and he sees Bill Long. And you don't mess with Bill Long. He knew he was in trouble. So he's running back to his horse, and he's trying to get on, and Bill Long shoots a second time, meaning that the kids can keep fishing, and he shoots the reins off the horse.
Oh, come on.
Can you imagine that? How does he shoot a little quarter-inch piece of leather off that horse? So
that would be the end of my game warden career if I was Hanson.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah, he told Perry Jackson one time that he says, "I've shot so many guns, I've shot so many times that I can," and he was in a cabin, 10 foot by 10 foot room. He says, "I can fill this cabin half full of ammo, spent casings." Wow. Because, you got a picture. He's an outlaw. Cow. So he is a professional gunman. Yeah. That was his life. That's what saved him every day he went out to do his work.
And he taught Perry how to shoot, didn't he?
Oh, man. Yeah, Perry was the youngest. And so at some point when he was about 14 or 15, Bill came to Perry and says, "Hey, you want to learn how to shoot?" He says, "Sure." So Bill Long gives him a pistol, and he says, "Go ahead and shoot at that target over there." And so, like any boy would do, naturally, you grab a hold of the pistol, and he puts the pointing finger in the trigger, and he starts to aim at the target. And Bill Long came down on him and hit him in the arm. And he says, "You don't shoot like that." And he says, "Let me show you how to shoot." And so he takes the gun, and instead of putting the point finger on the trigger, he takes the middle finger and puts on the trigger, and he puts the pointing finger right down the barrel. And he says, "You don't even aim, you just point and shoot with the middle finger. So point and
Mm.
shoot for quicker response."
I know, me
This
too.
has me wanting to try that out now.
Makes me think like the Army taught me wrong this whole time.
Yeah. Well, if you think about his world, everything is revolved around the escape from the bank robbery.
Yeah.
It's life and death moments.
Yeah, you just don't have time to sit there and aim and
No.
set up like you regularly would shoot a pistol. If we're looking at his identity, there's one story I think that sits in my mind as the one that really intrigues my interest, builds my interest, and that's a story that I think you heard from Marianne DeFay.
It was probably the most memorable story that she had. She has like a photographic memory. She was really good at Bill Long stories.
Mm-hmm.
She called him Grandpa. So she says, Grandpa went into a gun battle. She kind of got a little bit somber and serious. And she said that Grandpa went into a gun battle and a man got
Mm-hmm.
killed. And Bill Long rode off on a horse and took his identity with him. That blew us away. I mean, what does that mean? A hole was dug by probably Bill Long. The man was put in it. It was buried. And Bill Long realized, take that identity and nobody will know.
Oh man, it seems to be like a common thread with him. Like it seems like he's very, very concerned about people finding out who he is.
Well, the very same wall
Yeah.
that William Henry Long put up so that the law wouldn't catch him is the very same wall that we have today. There's no difference. Several of his granddaughters said that he was the smartest person that they had ever met. So William Henry Long was one intelligent person. And it's interesting to think that in our world today, almost everybody wants to brag about themselves. They want to say, well, I did this and I did that, or so and so did this, so and so did that. William Henry Long never did that in his whole life. And even on his deathbed, all he did was said who his mom and dad was. He wouldn't talk about the outlaw stuff. Never did once. That speaks volumes of the character of this guy. He was very, very good. It's not good enough just to know that he was William Henry Long and he married my second great grandma. It's not good enough. Who was this man?
And when you were going through all this research and you were doing these interviews, you came across, I think, one of the most important documents that we have to go by, and that is a family letter, right?
Yes. Several of the interviews that we had gone through, they told me about a sister's picture. I kept asking for pictures, pictures, pictures. No, no, no. But there was Bill Long's sister's picture. And
Mm-hmm.
they described it. They said one was standing, one was sitting, and it was 18 inches wide, 12 inches high, and it was on the wall in 1957 in Duchesne before the house got burnt. Bummer. And so I asked her, I says, is there any chance you have ever heard of a picture of Bill Long's sisters? And once again, there was a moment of silence. And she says, wow. She says, my sister has that picture. And my heart about came out of my mouth. I mean, it's like, holy cow, you have got to be kidding. And she not only has a picture of Bill Long, she also has a deathbed letter from Bill Long to his daughter Viola. And she is only lives 10 miles from here in Honeyville. So we drove down to Honeyville, and that was when I first met Sherma Payton. And so that's when she brought out the very first picture of the Bill Long sisters and the very first letter of Viola Long.
The letter.
Yeah.
What's the letter? What's up with the letter?
Well, the best that we can tell, and it's pretty close, is that this letter was written by Viola, which is his first oldest daughter, and of course her mother's my great-grandmother. And it was written in 1935. In fact, it says right here, my dad died last November 27th, 1936. So it would have been written in 1937, 36, 37. And so then the way I would describe this is this would have been a deathbed revelation, because he had spent his whole life covering up who he was, who his parents were, who his mom and dad was, or anybody in his family. His whole life until he's close to death. And then he finally broke down and told his daughter what she wrote down on these 2 pages. And I don't know, do you want me to go through that?
Yeah, if you could actually just read it, that would be awesome.
Okay, so here is the story that was written by Viola, and it was told by Bill Long on his deathbed. The story of my father, as near as I know. My father, William Henry Long, left his home when a very small boy. It seems as if grandfather went for him several times, but the cowboys hid him and kept my grandfather from finding him. Sometimes I wonder if his real name was Long.
Thank you for listening to Gunslinger's Shadow. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new about one of the most mysterious and elusive outlaws of the Wild West. If you have any information about Bill Long, the Robbers Roost Gang, or any other Western outlaws from the late 1800s, maybe you are a descendant of Bill Long, or of the Parker family, the Butch Cassidy family, the McCartys, or just have family stories that have been waiting generations to tell, we want to hear from you. Your story may well be the missing link that turns fiction into facts. We are right now actively researching the origins of Bill Long and the other outlaws he knew. So please, send us an email with the stories you want to share. We'll read every message and respond as soon as we can. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to, and join us for our next episode to find out the real story behind the real outlaws of the real Wild West.